So we're gonna kick off the panel. Thank you all for attending. We have relied almost exclusively on active listening techniques as psychologists, even though our field advocates for a multi-methods approach. Even though we talk all the time about common method variants, even though in this very conference I've heard people say we have different response rates for different demographics in our organization. So today, what we want to talk about is how to add to that approach using passive listening techniques. So today, as panelists, we'll share how we've used these techniques in our organizations and with clients, and talk about how those techniques have greatly added to our understanding of workforce needs, especially critical during a time of upheaval. We will cover methodologies like ONA and topic modeling. We will discuss our use of different data sources like recognition data, Slack, emails, etc. We're also planning to cover topics like nudges, user engagement, and using content versus volume data. We will talk about how this was an integral part of our strategies for engaging employees during a very difficult time, and how this played into the new increasingly virtual ways of working. And lastly, we will have a transparent discussion about privacy, trust building, ethics, and we will openly share challenges we have encountered and share our recommendations. So in short, all of that to say, you're in for a treat, ladies and gentlemen and non-binary. All right, so we will start with introducing ourselves as panelists. I will start, and then we will go down the line and get back to Evan, who is our moderator and who will pose the questions. So I'll keep my intro short. My name is Misha Ann Martin, and I work for a technology company called WorkHuman.
Great. All right, it is picking me up. My name is Kristen Sabo, and I work at the Boeing Company and head up employee listening and organizational research.
I'm Anthony Ferreras. I work at Lululemon as the global head of people analytics.
My name is Eddie Jordan, and I am a people scientist at Humu.
All right, and I'm Evan Seinar. I'm at BetterUp. We're a digital coaching and human transformation platform, and my role will be to moderate the questions, facilitate questions from you all. I would ask that if you don't mind putting them in the app, we'll go through those. We'll ask for questions live too as well, and my other job is to monitor the passive listening from the devices spread across this room right now, so that's my final job. All set? All right. Why should organizations, first of all, the why, I should say. Why should organizations consider a passive listening approach?
On the easy intervention category, but I don't think that retention is easy,
That might be the only way that's answering
period.
this question.
So I think taking that time to
I think the simplest way I can answer this question
connect with
is
people
that it
is pretty
meets
important.
the employees where they are.
And
It
allowing
doesn't
those,
add
like,
to their
networking
day.
opportunities so
It's
people feel like they
raw
are
and
part of
unprescribed.
something
And
more,
I think
and they see how they
the biggest thing
contribute
about
to
this
their team and their
this topic
organization.
in
And see where
particular
they're going
is
in that organization too.
We're trying to meet employees where they are during crises.
Certainly.
And in
So
particular,
now
what's been happening
we'll
in the
continue
last 2 years.
on this
We're
path of
very
interventions.
emotional
So the
creatures,
next question is,
and we're
are
often
high-level
challenged
retention practices helpful
when
for
we're
preventing
trying to be
turnover,
successful.
or should we consider
Our sanity is challenged, and if our employers are really interested in understanding our employee experience and improving our employee experience, it's not enough to ask very prescribed questions once or every 4 times a year if you're lucky, and by the way, only respond with strongly disagree to strongly agree on some of these things that me and HR have chosen to be worth asking you without consulting you. So passive listening, I think, nowadays with technology being the way it is, advanced the way it is, with data science now delving into natural language processing and other things like ONA, it's become easier to listen to our employees more often. And I'm not trying to dump on surveys. In fact, I got my start in people analytics doing survey research. And it's still very, very important. It's a baseline. But in between those times, things happen. And we need to understand what's happening so that we can improve that experience on time. It's quicker. We can react to things that are happening in the moment and show our employees that we really care because we're really, really listening in a more natural way.
All right. What do organizations gain from using these data?
So I'll jump in on this one first, and then I'll pass it back to you, I think, since we're the two internal folks in terms of our roles. You know, there's a lot to be gained from passive listening, and really it's about building the ecosystem of your listening strategy and approach, right? And with that, you need multiple methods. We talk about this as a fundamental approach to research methodology, and we always have to think about how fundamentals shift into application from a effectively thought product development, or the acquisition pipeline, as I sometimes like to think about it, when we think about the products we create as IO psychologists. And within that ecosystem, right, we have active forms of listening where we actively ask someone to give us something, and then there's the passive form where that active ask isn't present, and we get it organically because of the environments that people exist in. And so what does that bring you? Well, I like to build the analogy of the survey gives me what someone's gonna tell me in a boardroom, right? It's gonna be slightly filtered, probably in a direction that's going to highlight impression management for most people. And so it's gonna be informative, but you have to have it within the context of the culture you're operating in and the expectations of the type of feedback you're getting, right? A lot of times those survey questions also in a boardroom kind of mentality, you're not looking for always the real raw story. You're looking for the story that you can package to deliver to show a strategic KPI for your organization, right? So you're actually looking for the favorable response. You're not looking for the response that gives you the highest variability. You kind of want the ceiling effect. And then when we look at passive listening, I call that the water cooler conversation, right? What are the things you say to your buddies when you're just chatting in the hallway, or in the virtual world of COVID of like, hey, can I give you a call right after the meeting, right? Or on the message board in your company, or going on Glassdoor and rating your company, right? Those are all those water cooler conversations that are less formal, sometimes more dramatic in the speak, perhaps more dramatic than is actually realistic, and you have to balance that in terms of the valence of the data. But that together then gives you this nice ecosystem that balances itself out and actually triangulates your types of listening to be more exact and accurate then in that triangulation, because those different modalities can balance each other out.
I can't say much more than that. That's right on. The only things that I would add is that, you know, it's much more efficient, I think, to listen to ambient data that's just lying out there, you know, and it's a gold mine that no one is discovering. They know it exists, but nobody's discovering it. It's free insights that a company can have as long as they know how to mine it. So it's efficient. There's less guesswork around it, and in many cases, our employees are telling us exactly what to do or what's wrong. So it's going from theory to knowing in many cases. So obviously, there are some cases where we have to make assumptions, and it's much more timely, I think, than in other modality. But it adds to the story. It adds to understanding more of the employee experience. You know, and there's just a lot more to discover from something like unstructured data that already exists out there, where we're not making an assumption by building out like a engagement, 5 items to build an engagement model or something like that. In one of my past companies, I won't say which, but there was a long-standing thought that people leave their managers, not their company. And what we ended up discovering just from comment data, for example, in the surveys, we learned so much more from comment data than we did from the rating questions. We discovered that no, people love their managers. People are leaving the company and their policies, not their managers. And we wouldn't have gotten that with the assumptions that we made on which questions we should be asking on a survey.
All right. So we'll next turn to the what of passive data. What kinds of data have you used and where did it come from?
Sure. Right, so answering this question, I think, starts with what are we listening for, or what kind of inputs do we need for the outcomes? And in our case at Humu, it's a little different than just listening in that primarily we want to take data in to determine which nudge should we send to each individual that's going to have the biggest impact. And from our perspective, when we talk about nudges, they're these personalized coaching moments in which we encourage people to take action that is going to be most likely to lead to a successful outcome. So the key thing there is personalization. So if we have the need to make sure that people consume the nudge in a way that is going to be relevant to their work environment, to their context, what they're working on, is we need to know a lot about them. And so some of the signals that we take in right now are as straightforward as HRIS data. By having that, we know things such as tenure, we know where you work, we know the departments, we know who's on your team. So very straightforward, but when we combine that with other data sources, it can get very granular in terms of how do we know what's going to have the biggest impact for each person. So again, having that basic HRIS data that we can then combine with other data sources is a starting point for us. Other data sources that we use are how are people engaging with the nudges? So things as straightforward as are there particular types of nudges that people are opening versus others? Once they've received the nudge, there are a lot of different data points that we can track from there as well. We can see, are they saving the nudges? Are they going back to the nudges? Is there a timing component of it? So again, these are passive data sources that can inform us as to how can we hone this to make it more personalized and more impactful. A few other things that we found are basically just the combination of passive and active data. So I know that kind of starts to blend the two topics a bit, but when we're able to look at things such as we know that there's a group here of low-performing managers, for example. When we look at that group and then cut that by what are we nudging them on? What are they asking to be nudged on? That provides an insight that we wouldn't get otherwise, because that way we can hone in on that group and see, gosh, for these managers that are struggling, they're asking for help on goal setting, building psychological safety, collaboration. Knowing that, are there other resources, are there other things that we should be doing as an organization to support that population? Related to that, and this is something that we're just starting to do, is we, in addition to taking in data to determine nudge prioritization, we also ask people, what are some of the things that you're working on? Where would you like to receive more support? And looking at those selections and inferring sentiment from what people are asking for is another way to get some additional data to see, gosh, if they're asking for these things, do we have potentially a burnout concern? Is there an area over here that we might want to focus on from a well-being perspective based on where people are being drawn to ask for additional resources? And one other source that we're getting ready to use more of, so I don't have the back end of what the results have been, but we are starting to use calendar integrations as well. And multiple sources for this, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a subsequent question, but it does kind of raise that question of not only what is the organization getting from this, but what is the individual getting from it? So when we think about really personalizing that data, democratizing that data, what needs to go into that as we are drawing from more sources, and what do we need to share with the individual?
So my company is called WorkHuman, and the primary product is a social recognition product. So imagine you do something at work that I appreciated, that meant a lot to me in terms of task or social support. I send you a note explaining exactly what it was that you did that meant so much to me, and I can attach a monetary value to that. When our clients get to a state of robustness where, that's happening quite a lot in the culture, and that's just part of the way they operate, that becomes a rich source of data for us to mine for all these insights.
Great. So the next question is, what should we use this information for? And I'm actually going to make an editorial suggestion and say, what should we not use this information for?
I can start and give some examples of how we've used recognition data and mined it for insight. So, for example, during COVID, when we mined that data, just because people were in the habit of using it, we were able to get some unique insights around how the work was changing at the time. So, for example, for one client, we found that before the pandemic, they were talking a lot about just training, traditional training on the sales team. But as the pandemic wore on, they started talking more about things that were related to adapting to a virtual sales cycle, for example. So we knew that that was something that was trending. So that's something that we do for our clients a lot. Look in that data to see what's trending. As people are giving each other social support using this mechanism, what are they supporting each other around, or about? It gives us an idea of what people are struggling with. So just looking at the words and how they changed over time during this event was particularly insightful. Another thing we do, because our clients usually use their values as categories, and so we mine the data to see what are the most common things coming up under each value. Like, how are people actually living these values in practice? And that can give you some really interesting things. So for example, let's say, a company has a value of execution, as many companies do, and then you mine the data around recognition around execution, and you see that people are often recognizing for people working weekends or after hours. Well, all of a sudden, now your burnout question on your survey makes a lot of sense because of the behaviors that your organization is reinforcing. So that's just a couple of examples from our side.
From my perspective, I think I covered a lot of this in my previous response. I mean, how we use this information is primarily to determine how can we best personalize and focus the nudges that we send. I think the other component is how can we take the information to provide insights that the organization may not otherwise have line of sight to. So how can we take things like, again, that nudge engagement in a particular area for different demographic categories, report that back so that you can see, again, what is the relationship between what people are asking for and where they sit in the organization. I think another piece in terms of information not to use is something that we think about a lot is determining how do we communicate why people received a given nudge. And that's a critical component, because sometimes we'll have a nudge will be sent, people will think, gosh, did you see me do that thing last week? Why am I getting this nudge? It's just to make sure that we're giving that understanding of these are the data points that are coming in, and these are the factors, and being very transparent about these are the factors that go into those selections. Just for an example of what not to do would be something like using demographic information to be a primary determinant. So for example, to say, hi, as an older individual, I bet you get confused by technology. So here's a nudge about making sure that you get with a mentor to make sure you understand the resources that you have access to. That's not going to land very well. So there are clearly some data signals that you should not be using, just thinking about that user experience, thinking about what you're trying to get across, and making sure that that is transparent and it's something that makes contextual sense to the person receiving it.
Thanks for that. So turning to the how of passive listening, what kinds of ethical or privacy concerns should we consider, and what shall we do about that?
I'll talk about what I'm told are the problems and privacy concerns, and then I'll give my assessment of that based on reality. I'm told by like our CIO, CSO, the CISO is what we call them, chief security officers and so forth, is that these are private. Well, it depends on the data, first of all. But let's talk about the worst case scenario, like Slack data, for example, or messenger information. So that these are private messages. People prefer to be think that this is just going to one other person or a specific prescribed group of people, that sort of thing. It's not meant to be used by others. There's a moral issue to that. Privacy. How do we deal with like company secrets that are shared over Slack or Teams or whatever the case is? And then you have other, depending on the data, you have other scenarios where GDPR or what's the other one, CCPA, right? That come into play with those scenarios. Yes, okay, so the legal ones I get. So in the situations that I've run into with those, I usually try to get real reactions from the people who I am going to evaluate in aggregate their information. Usually, the first time that I did this, that I implemented this type of listening program, I ran a focus group to understand what would be the concerns. And I asked, how would you feel if we, in aggregate, not looking specifically at what you specifically are saying, but in aggregate, understanding how people feel, how people are reacting to certain events, that's what we're most interested in. And the response that I got back was, oh, I thought you were already doing that. What I found is that it depends on who is evaluating whether we should be doing this. And usually the people who are saying no or blocking it are people who didn't grow up in a very transparent culture with like social media and things like that. And so a lot of my colleagues who did, or peers who did in companies, did grow up in that. And they just are very transparent folks. Now that's not across the board. Obviously, there are still some concerns. But my point is, it's weird, yeah. I get that, but I think, have to understand both sides of it and find a way to make it okay for everyone by, showing the evidence.
Yeah, so this is always an interesting question, being a leader of listening for a global company, because going to your response, different countries and regions have different rules around data privacy. And it is becoming increasingly complex as more regions come on board in terms of their privacy regulations, in terms of how you handle that. And that is largely where I see concerns around passive listening sitting from a practical standpoint. From the ethical standpoint, I think as organizational psychologists and IO psychologists, we're trained from day one around the ethics of listening to people, right? That is literally what we are trained to do, is to understand the felt experience of individuals in workplace settings through the scientific method, and then package that up in a valuable format to identify trends to that, right? Those are research findings that we aggregate over time. So we are trained in the ethics of this inherently, and so for me, in a corporate environment, it's sometimes difficult to have conversations with people about the ethics of listening, because it's so inherent to what I do and how I do it, because I was trained in that from day one. So I would never approach something without a people-first mentality. Or would I be comfortable with this? Maybe, oh, okay, yes, I would be, right? Going to the what am I comfortable with? So on the ethical standpoint, you always have to get into the other person's shoes. And I think the biggest issue that comes to mind is just the perception of creepiness. Like, maybe call it your creepy factor, I don't know. at what point does data triangulation over time become creepy? And if you've crossed the creepy threshold with listening, even if you're being ethical, then you need to check yourself, because this is a bit of a PR game, right? If people perceive that you're doing something differently from what you're actually doing, you are now in a problematic state, because your data is only going to be as good as the trust of the person giving it to you. So with listening in general, and passive listening in particular, if I don't have the trust of the employee base or population that's giving me the data, it doesn't matter. So that's the bottom line for my ethical considerations, is if I've broken trust or challenged the integrity of my process, data, or the agreement I have with the individual giving me, then that's a no-go, right? You don't move forward. If, however, I am demonstrating integrity, sticking with the ethical guidelines that we all have because we have been trained in them, and also I haven't crossed the creepy threshold, we're good. The technicality, though, of that comes into place when we have to talk about regulations, policies, and laws. And that's actually a different conversation that oftentimes ends up conflated with the ethics. They are based in the same home, right? So when I work with our security officers and our privacy office, and I work very closely with them, I mean, they work very closely with us. We are tied at the hip for most of what we do. They're coming at it from a point of no, right? Like they start with no and we start with yes, because that's our job. But what they're looking at is making sure we're not breaking the law. And so they are also trained in the ethical principles like the Belmont Report that we are trained in. But they're trained in it from a different subset of knowledge and context. And so when you're working with them, those considerations are different of how do I make sure the data transfer is secure, right? That's different from the trust of the person giving it to you, of the ethics of collecting the information. It's security of data. It's who owns the data, right? In Europe, the person that gave you the data owns it. In the United States, minus a couple of states, it's the person who collected the data owns the data, right? And so those are the considerations you have to make, and this world is becoming more and more complex as people gain ownership of their actual data, which is probably a good thing, right? But it also means that those of us working in the space of listening and trying to aggregate it and form synthesis and interpretation now do need to be mindful of the rules and regulations in a different sort of way.
Great, thanks for that. Do you feel that passive listening is appropriate for any organizational culture, and why or why not, or what are some of the considerations, the cultural considerations that you would factor into this strategy?
So I think it can be. And, you know, I want to piggyback on something you said, Kristen, about trust. I think if you're grounded in what you're trying to do and if what you're trying to do is fundamentally altruistic, then you can make it work. And I'll give a very specific example. I'm really passionate about inclusion analytics and really understanding the sentiment of different types of people in the workforce. You know, I think a lot of people would say, well, you know, when we look at our engagement survey and response rates, not everybody is responding. And so I think we need to get creative in looking at different data sources to see how different people are experiencing the organization. And if we communicate that intent to the organization accordingly, who's going to argue with that intent, right? And so I think that for any organizational culture, if you ground it in something that is fundamentally a good thing to do and understand, you can probably get the organization on board, especially with the considerations that Kristen just outlined.
Don't have much to add with that. I mean, I agree. I think a lot of it comes down to what is the psychological contract that has been established between the organization and their employees, and how are you reinforcing that? And so I think what Michan described covers a lot of the principles that need to be in place. I think there's also a bit of an administrative or more logistical consideration as well, and that is making sure that how this process is communicated, the level of detail, and by whom. Making sure that we have the right stakeholders who are involved in this, how it gets rolled out, how it shoulders up to other initiatives that are already in place relative to culture. So where does this fit in terms of a culture initiative versus something that's intended to drive productivity? Those are things that I think would determine readiness. And looking at essentially the track record of initiatives around how you've collected data, how they've been used, feedback you've gotten from employees, all need to go into that consideration. So I think there's the what sits in the organization itself from a principal perspective, but then we also need to give very intentional methods to how we go about rolling it out and how it gets communicated.
And if you think your organization might not be ready, start with things that are already public, right? So, for example, in a Slack channel, a public Slack channel, the data is already out there, right? So I think people are not going to have such a reaction to analyzing it. I said WorkHuman was a social recognition product, so those notes, if the recipient and the giver agrees that they're not private, it ends up on a social feed for everybody to see. So when you analyze that data, it's not perceived the same as if you're going into somebody's inbox, for example. So maybe start with those if there are concerns, and then build the trust to go to other places.
We have some recommendations from the panel, but I actually like to swap in some questions from the audience because we're getting quite a few. What tools have you built to collect passive data, and how have you set up triggers or guidelines that tell you when to act?
So I'll start with actually piggybacking on what you just talked about of where do you start passive listening, right? Right now, I am in the process of a build around a listening strategy, right? And that means taking people on this journey with us, because the trust is critical. So my team has to be the most trusted team in the company when it comes to people data, because our data is more sensitive, because I don't know what's going on in your head unless you share it, right? That you cannot get much more personal than that. And so in that strategy of building, you start with what is clearly public. And then you are, to Eddie's point, incredibly transparent. Informed consent, bottom line, right? Everything involves informed consent. People need to know up front, and you need to be honest with it. You can't parse words. You can't try to talk around it. There cannot be any of that, even though sometimes it means an uncomfortable conversation. And you just have to be up front. So we will run company-wide announcements when we change how we're doing something with regards to listening to inform people. That can be a bit scary, because then you get comments on those announcements. But then that feeds into your listening. So it's a very interesting cycle. But you start with those public forums, and as we become more comfortable with that, and see that you're maintaining integrity. So what tools are we using? What forums are we using? Comments on news articles, internal and external. Glassdoor, LinkedIn, right? These are external and internal functions. Internal community boards that we have that are electronic, where people can post comments. And then you start to walk into things like email. And you might not be looking at the content of someone's email. You may actually just be looking at who are they inviting to a meeting. So you can do an ONA analysis to determine, like, is there a diversification issue going on here? Is it all men? Is it all female? You can start actually getting at those things in really interesting ways, quite simply, by not getting into the granularity of the content, which might equal creepy factor, but getting into simply who showed up.
Thanks for that. One thing I would add to that, just with regards to timing and triggers, and again, a lot of what we're trying to do is build a personalized experience that resonates. And so we do need some passive data up front to know who people are, as much as we can get, just in terms of where do you sit in the organization, tenure, all that kind of stuff. But what we've learned over time, and I think we've kind of talked around this a little bit as well, is people still want agency. The real benefit of listening strategies and other strategies in general is I want to have my voice heard and acted upon. And so sometimes we can lose that connection a little bit from a passive standpoint. So one of the things that we found is, sure, up front, we're going to collect passive data to set up a program and start running it, But then one of the very first things that we do as part of that program is we ask people very active, overt questions around, here's this program, this is where you are in the organization. Give us a little bit more from your perspective as to what your context is. And you're going to be going through a program that has some things that we think are going to be a good fit for you, but tell us from this list of 10 things, what are you focusing on and what would be valuable to you? So again, I think to me it just speaks back to that balance of passive and active and making sure that we're not losing sight of that agency that people want to have. It may show up as relevant to me, but if it shows up in a way that either comes across as creepy or is missing context, then we need to find another way to plug that gap.
I love this next question from the audience. So please elaborate on the importance of using passive listening to give a voice to groups who are underrepresented by active listening methods.
Yeah, so we've done that in recognition data a lot. And you can learn a lot when you're looking at, when you have an organization that has a robust culture around giving and receiving recognition, but you see gaps in groups that are not participating in that experience, despite your impact studies that show that giving and receiving is related to engagement and retention. So we did a couple of intersectional studies with clients this year, and we found, for example, that Black men were not giving and receiving at the same rate as everybody else. So they were basically not benefiting. We've looked at the language used to describe accomplishments of people in the same role, male versus female. And we found that people are literally using different words when they are describing the accomplishments of males and females. So these are some of the things that people can feel in organizations. You know, they can feel left out. You know, somebody says something to you that gives you an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of your stomach, but you may not necessarily even have the language to describe what's happening or how you feel. But when we surface these things in something like, you know, recognition data, all of a sudden we give data to start having a conversation around, you know, what people are experiencing and whether they're, you know, being let in or being left out.
I'll give a little bit of a different twist on who shows up and doesn't show up in active listening from the perspective of a company that has factory employees. So, you know, I work at Boeing. We build airplanes. That does not generally happen in front of a computer because you're in a factory building an airplane. And so what we find with our active listening is those populations tend to be underrepresented in terms of their ability to even get to the computer at the right point in time to answer the survey, particularly because we use continuous listening approaches and sampling approaches, which means that at any given moment, you might not know that week you're getting a survey. So we can't have a big campaign of everyone go to your computer this week, right? And so as a result, we have to embed in other ways of getting voice from people that otherwise aren't sitting in a traditional office setting, which is really where active listening is the easiest from like a surveying standpoint. And so you have to use other techniques. And so using forums, I also should mention like Reddit is an incredible forum as an employer. It's very interesting what people put on Reddit threads. But again, you get to the water cooler talk and you're like, wow, that's real and raw. What is going on there? But then it allows you to pull some threads in terms of your other data to start investigating. Like, is this real and raw, or is this perhaps people building on each other in terms of exacerbating a conversation and really getting into that, but grabbing that for populations that otherwise maybe because of their work setting can't show up in the active listening is really critical, because that is your product in many times when you're in those types of organizations, right? They're building your product and yet you're not getting their voice.
I'll give one more simple example. Let's say you ask me on an employee survey, you know, a question about being included in important meetings. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I'm included in important meetings. But what if I don't know that important meetings are going on without me, right? And so I'm like, well, I think I'm being included when I'm supposed to be included. I know I'm not as connected, right, to key resources in the organization like other people, but I don't really understand how that happened and I don't know why. And oh, by the way, and nobody talks about this part, is it me? That's, and that hurts, I can tell you that one, right? But when you look at something like passive listening from a calendar and you look at a particular role and you split it by demographic and you go, okay, wait a minute, so if you're in this demographic and you're in this role, you tend to be in this type of meeting, but if you're in the same role and you're a different demographic, you tend not to be. That's a different story that is equally as important as what somebody can tell you.
That's very powerful. Thanks for sharing that. There's also a question that asks about an implicit assumption about the size of the company or volume of data you have access to, and what advice would you give to companies with smaller populations or with relatively quiet employees?
So I hate to keep going back to recognition data, but that's where I live, right? So in these small companies, what happens is you have all these gift cards in a drawer and you just give them out, right? Like, we've seen this and nobody tracks it. And so, the company doesn't realize that a certain type of person is always getting the gift card. But the certain type of person who's not getting the gift card, oh, they feel that, right? So I always just say you can start somewhere. Whatever processes are happening in your organization, like even if you use an Excel spreadsheet, like just track it so you can at least have the discipline of looking at it to see what's going on.
I think sometimes we forget that passive listening can happen while you're actively listening. And so sometimes I was actually just sitting down with a colleague who owns a small business, about 50 employees, and he was trying to get more feedback from his employees. And I presented to him a variety of options and tools, right, around here's the purpose of a focus group if you run it as the CEO, and here's the purpose of a focus group if you have an external person run it, and this is how that triangulates together, and this is where a survey might fit in, but you're smaller, so do you need a survey or just a conversation? But something I also mentioned to him is literally who accepts the invitation to even come to the focus group? You could invite everybody, but some people might self-select out. Well, that's actually a form of kind of passively listening to what's going on through people's actions. And so I think we also have to remember in smaller organizations where perhaps you don't have the volume that justifies like a census survey or something of that nature because it really doesn't create anonymity for people because there's just not enough people, that you can also host these types of events and engagements and look at how people are showing up to inform what the networks in your company are, how people feel comfortable engaging, or if they feel comfortable engaging. Because a company that's really quiet, you then have to ask, why are they quiet? Because when people are around people that they're comfortable with, even if it's a quiet individual, they still have voice. And so you do have to ask those questions and kind of flip the question sometimes and look between the lines to interpret it.
Well, let's take the last few minutes for any questions in the room. We have a few more in Q&A, so we can go through those. But any questions from anyone here in the room? Yes. Curious about the data side of passive listening. So what's the data strategy associated with passive listening? Okay.
I think it depends on your resourcing for sure and your strategy, whether you go with like kind of internal builds and external build, or a vendor-based, that sort of thing. But I think both data science and technology has come a long way, and the most entry-level data scientists can do NLP, natural language processing. So if you wanted to take a listen to like, aggregate messages or something like that, O&A tends to be on the easier side to do for a certain type of roles, so you could do that. But there are also technologies, there's Humu, obviously, there's, Better Up that's doing passive listening stuff too, that could probably scale to more or better, depending on your type of resourcing. So it depends on the type of data that you're looking at. Some are easier than others, but technology and data science has made it even easier.
One thing I'll add, and it's on a slightly different topic, but I think it's relevant to the data that you can get access to and how you want to use it. And that is the reality for us, and I don't know if it changes that much if you're internal or if you're an external vendor like Humu, but for passive listening data that we want to take in, people have to opt in. And certainly when you look at something like if Humu's going to integrate with your calendar, we have to have each individual say, yes, you can do so. So what that means for us is we have to clearly communicate the value. So that's a big part of, before we even get the data, we have to clearly articulate, this is what this will unlock for you. So if we're able to get this additional data from your calendar, for example, then we can look at who you're meeting with, who you're communicating with, make some recommendations as to how you can make those interactions be more effective, make some recommendations about other people that you may need to meet. But again, to first have the right to get that data, we have to communicate what the value is for the individual, and then we can build in more of how we want to take on the analysis from there.
One more thing on like the buy-in that is mentioning. I think once you get past the CISO level, getting buy-in is relatively easy for the value of it, in my experience. But you still have the hurdle of something like legal and making sure that even those who think there's value in this understand that it's not creepy. And part of it, like everybody else is saying, is being transparent to the employees that this is what you're going to do with the data, and giving them a chance to opt out if they need to. But once you get to that point, my strategy is essentially, once I've gotten all that yes, my strategy is usually say yes back to any of the limitations that they're trying to put on you, and pilot. And show them the value, even with the limitations that they give you. I mean, some of those limitations could be, okay, don't read emails, but you could take the subject line, or who people are sending to, that sort of thing. You could get a lot of value from just that information. Don't tell my companies this, but I'd be happy if they just gave me that. But obviously I want more, but yeah, say yes. After they say yes to whatever limitations they put on you.
There was a question over there, yes. So how do you explain passive data to someone outside the industry that's not as familiar with the approach?
I can just start from my perspective, and this is probably an overgeneralization, but it's how we typically start. It's explaining what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And I talk about, we want to take in as much signal as we can. The more signal that we can get, the more effective we can be, the more targeted we can be, the more personalized we can be. And then I'll walk through examples of what that signal is. And that can include kind of a continuum. And so using whatever language we feel will resonate with whoever you're talking with, is saying, all right, this is stuff that I'm going to directly ask people. And this is stuff that likely already exists. Ideally, I can combine that. But just making sure that there's a clear purpose for all sorts of data, but then walking them through kind of what that continuum is. And that will probably lead to some pros and cons. What are some of the steps, as we've talked about here? I mean, are there different procedures that we need to take on depending on where the data sit in that continuum? But that's how I typically start the conversation.
All right, we are at time, so I'd like to, again, thank the expert panelists. Thanks so much. And because it is the last session of the day, you get the end-of-day bonus, so you can decide either to come up to the panelists or maybe offer to buy them a drink at the happy hour with these experts. And we also know that there were a few questions. I think we got to most of them, but maybe we could commit to going through just in case we didn't get to all of them. So if you asked a question we didn't get to live, we'll follow up. And thanks so much for coming. Have a great rest of your day.